Seattle, April 2019. I was driving an older Toyota Prius with the license plate partially obscured by a parking sticker, registered in my app as Car 47, and I remember every tiny detail because it felt like evidence later. I had taken driving for a living to pay off rent and to buy back time after a year of nights freelancing and mornings commuting. For me, it was routine: playlists, small talk, the smell of coffee and leather, and the quiet satisfaction of getting someone where they needed to go. That night, the city was damp. The streetlights blurred into halos, and I thought the only surprises would be traffic or a surge fare. For weeks, the weekdays had been calm, passengers nodding off to their own podcasts, someone always asking if they could put their bag on the back seat, smiling when I suggested a shortcut. My car number sticker was on the lower right of the windshield, a detail I mentioned to two different passengers like a joke, like it mattered at all. Then, over the radio, a passenger asked me to go to an address I knew by heart, and the quiet of that familiar route was cut by a single abrupt sound, a scream in the rearview mirror, and I felt my whole idea of what a night shift could be collapse. I will tell you what I saw, how I reacted, how the company and the authorities responded, and how those 5 rides changed me. If you have ever ordered a ride late at night, listen closely, because none of this felt inevitable until it happened. I had been driving for nearly 18 months when the rides that broke the pattern began. My backstory is not a list of traumas, but of small losses and practical choices that made me take the wheel. I grew up in a small town where my mother ran a diner and my father worked construction. As a kid, I learned to notice patterns the same way a cook notices how a batter holds together. I left for college with more curiosity than confidence, studied literature for the pleasure of sentences, and then let reality nudge me into odd jobs. After graduation, I moved to the city with 2 suitcases and a stack of rejection emails. I lost a job at a bookstore when their lease ended and took a series of short contracts that never stuck. The Uber app arrived like a way to level things out. Nights driving let me write during daylight, save, and pay off a loan. It was a period of pragmatic solitude, the kind that makes a person talk to strangers more safely than to friends. In those long hours, I learned to read faces as maps of need, whether someone wanted to talk or to be left alone. And that skill sometimes felt like a superpower and sometimes like a burden. When the first shocking ride happened, I was 32, tired.
The next part of my backstory is about grief and a recalibration. I had lost my younger sister 2 years earlier to an overdose, and that accident left me with a heightened sense of vigilance and a hardness under my skin I did not recognize until I saw it reflected in my rear view. I went to therapy for a year and learned to label feelings, to slow down when adrenaline came up, to breathe and to count to 5. Driving was both a refuge and a place where my caution was tested. Names started to stick. I remember a woman called Maya who always asked for a bottle of water, the man named Alex who slept with a paperback in his lap, the teenager Jenna who tapped rapidly at her phone. Those patterns made faces predictable. My sister Lily's death meant I trusted instincts shaped by fear and love, and when passengers slipped beyond predictable shapes into something darker, I noticed it faster than I might otherwise have. That sensitivity would be crucial during the 5 rides I am about to describe. Finally, there was a neutral present that seemed ordinary until it was not. I had a savings target to hit, a small plant on my dashboard, and a daily ritual of checking oil and making a thermos of tea. Friends teased me about the playlist I used when the nights felt empty. I kept a paper notebook folded under the passenger seat to write down details when the city blurred into each other. License numbers, odd remarks, a scent that would later return like a clue. Those winters of steady work made me feel competent in small ways. Then the sequence of rides began, and the notebook became a ledger of things I could not unsee. The nights that contained the 5 rides were different weeks, but they felt like one long sequence in my memory, stitched together by the same engine hum and the same streetlight halos. The routine of the night shift started with the same checklist: app on, music set, thermos full. The car smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old coffee. The seats were worn but familiar under my hands, and the radio kept a low ambient noise that passengers often asked me to lower. On a brisk Tuesday, I picked up a woman named Lydia near a hospital who asked me to take her to a shelter, and she smelled of disinfectant and cinnamon. On another night, I collected Marcus, a tall man in a construction vest coming off a late shift, who hummed under his breath and kept checking his hands as if to be reassured they were still steady. I met Tom, a graduate student, who practiced lines for a presentation until he realized I was listening and then apologized. There was Carla from dispatch, who messaged drivers with a calm that felt like a hardwired lifeline, and Sam, the security officer at the downtown garage, who waved us through the gate most nights. These people were background until they were not. My voice at the wheel was a companionable baritone, and my small talk was intentionally simple. How was your night? You have a favorite route? Do you need the AC? The ordinary warmth of these exchanges invited trust. Passengers often left a receipt or a jacket and then texted a thank you. We joked about traffic and complained about the price of gas. That sense of normality made the first odd ride stand out like a broken plate on a stone floor. If you are watching this and you feel unsettled, I know the feeling. If this story prompts something in you, write in the comments what you would do in a corridor between the curb and the door if someone started crying and refused to get out. Or start with, "I would have," and finish the sentence. I read comments, and I value the crowd wisdom that emerges when strangers piece together better responses. Share if you have a short experience about a ride that made you nervous, and keep it brief to protect privacy. I bring this up here because the third ride begins just after the place where most viewers would assume they knew the rest. Now, back to the narrative. The first of the 5 rides happened late on a Friday. I picked up a man named Alex at a bar on Pine Street who smelled of cheap cologne and wet wool. He got in quiet, gave me an address uptown, and slid his phone between the passenger seat and console. At first he was asleep. Then his breathing changed. I tried small talk. "Rough night," I said. "You okay to get home?" he mumbled. He smelled of alcohol and something metallic. The ride should have been ordinary. At a red light he woke and asked me to stop the car. He fumbled with his pockets and pulled out a small gun, not pointed at me, but visible. His eyes ran over me like someone deciding whether I was a threat or an ally. The city sounds receded, and all I could hear was the tick of the turn signal. I remember the exact texture of his voice when he said, "You drive me, you do not get involved." My first impulse was to keep moving, to follow the GPS and put distance between us and the bar. I slowed, kept my hands on the wheel, voice steady. "We can handle this right. We can go where you need to." He laughed, a laugh that sounded like something behind a curtain, and for a moment I thought of the small paper notebook under the seat. The light turned green. We drove. I made a mental map of exits and potential safe spots, thinking of Sam at the garage and whether I could call dispatch. Dialogue kept filling the air between us in short, careful exchanges and subtext so thick it felt like fog. The moment the gun was in the car demands a slowed section to breathe, to explain the decisions and the clashing of fear and protocol. I remember the interior lights, the way his hand trembled, the metallic smell moving over the vinyl. My training from defensive driving resources suggested one thing and my instinct another. My mouth said, "Where are you headed?" And inside I ran through options: pull over, call the police, contact Uber support, or try to calm him. I asked him about the gun gently, asked if it was licensed. He said his name was Michael and that he needed cash. He began to tell fragments of a story about debt, threats, and someone named Jenna who had crossed him. The conversation stretched toward 10 exchanges, an ebb and flow of questions and deflections, each response bearing meaning beyond the words. He alternated between anger and a pleading softness. He told me not to look at his hands, but his voice broke when he mentioned his mother. That human crack was my lifeline. I told him, truthfully, I want to keep us both safe. He used the word safe back, as if choosing whether to trust me. We passed under a bridge, and I made a decision to take an exit lit by a 24-hour gas station with bright fluorescent lights and cameras visible on the pumps. I pulled in slowly, and as my car rolled toward the pump, someone tapped on the window. It was a woman who had been at the bar, who had seen us leave, and who asked quietly if I needed anything. Alex looked at her and lowered the gun. The interplay of human eyes was a pivot. After more words that made up an additional 9 exchanges, the man stepped out, left the gun on the seat, and walked away. A few minutes later, the police arrived. The scene felt like a rescue and like a near miss all at once. The stakes had been high, and the slow decisions mattered. The second ride came on a rainy Sunday, when the app pinged and I went to pick up a college student named Jenna from a late-night campus event. She got in drenched, wrapped in a sweater that smelled faintly of smoke and citrus. She told a story about an argument with a roommate and asked me to stop at an ATM. Halfway through the route, she suddenly started laughing in a way that did not fit the situation. The laugh was high-pitched and kept repeating, like a glitch. I asked, "Are you okay?" And she said, between laughs, "I am fine, I am fine, I am fine." Then she reached under her seat and produced a small package that rattled. The laughter stopped, and her face folded up into something raw. We pulled over, and she began to weep. And then, louder, and started to talk about a man who had followed her and taken photos. She named him Terry. The dialogue that followed was jagged, 8 to 9 exchanges long, each line revealing a frightened pattern. I listened and let the car be a container for words. I called dispatch quietly and asked if I could leave the trip to report a concern. They instructed me to stay with the passenger and, if safe, to take her to a well-lit public place. That night, we drove to a 24-hour diner where the fluorescent lights kept everything honest. I sat while she flushed and explained, showed me screenshots of messages, and cried into the napkins. The sensory memory of the diner is sharp, the coffee strong and bitter, the vinyl on the seats sticky, the hum of the grill, the faint smell of bleach from the bathrooms. After more dialogue and the arrival of a campus safety officer named Ramirez who filed a report, Jenna left with a friend. Her trembling stopped in the presence of clear, procedural action. That encounter left me with a sense of how small rituals of service, combined with institutional response, could make a real difference. The third ride, which produced perhaps the most unsettling headline, happened the night of a concert. I picked up 3 people who were loud and bright, neon wristbands like small levitating moons. One of them, Marcus, sat in the back and kept shifting his weight. About halfway to their destination, Marcus asked me to turn down the music. His hands had a scent of motor oil and something sweet. Then, suddenly and without warning, a man in the back seat pulled down the hood and a small, extremely realistic mask lay folded on his lap. He put it on and began to speak in a voice that was not his own. "We are not from here," he said, the words thinly veiled like a bad radio effect. The others laughed uncertainly. The conversation turned into a series of provocations. I asked him to keep the volume down. He answered with sarcasm and shifting humor. The dialogue moved through at least 10 exchanges as he played the role of a disruptive comedian trying to push boundaries. Then his hand went for something in a duffel bag, and the fabric made a soft scraping sound. The backseat energy shifted. I suggested, calmly, "If you are uncomfortable, we can end the ride." He looked at me and replied, "Make me." At that point, my decision was to stop in a crowded, well-lit area near a gas station and call for backup from dispatch. Carla from dispatch sent a message instructing me to keep doors locked, to remain visible, and that help would be on the way. The 10-minute stretch that followed required a slow, steady negotiation of power. He finally left without violence after a passenger named Olivia stood up and said quietly, I'm getting out here." Her simple assertion shifted the dynamic. The mask was left on the seat. The crowd at the pumps watching created a social backup that I think mattered more than any formal procedure in that moment. The fourth ride involved a passenger who should not have been picked up, according to his own admission.
His name was Tom, and he was a visitor from out of state wearing a suit with a faint smell of aftershave and the sea. He handed me a folded envelope and asked me to take him to a pier where the light was low and the water black. Along the way, he began to talk about people he had seen falling from rocks, about how the sea took what was owed. His speech was smooth at first, then jagged, and he kept repeating a phrase, "They do not talk when the tide goes down." His hands were white against his lap. I kept the conversation going with small neutral questions in 8 to 9 exchanges, asking about family, about work, and noting patterns of obsession. At a bridge, he asked me to stop. He opened the envelope and took out a small folded photograph that he covered as if it were fragile. The sight of the photograph turned the air cold. He told me a story about a man who had been his colleague, who disappeared, and how guilt had become a presence he could not carry. The tension built into a tight knot, and for 2 paragraphs I slowed the narrative to describe his face, the wet sheen of his eyes, the way the light from street lamps hit his cheekbones. He cried once and then smashed the photograph between his hands, and I thought I might be the only witness left to what was a private disaster. He stepped out at the pier and walked into the night. I called the number on the delivery address later that night to report an abandoned item and possible welfare concern. That alone started a small chain of checks from local services. The 5th ride was the one that left me shaken for weeks. I picked up a woman named Maya who had the practiced posture of someone who had learned to make herself small in public. She sat in the back, and when I asked where she was going, she gave an address in an industrial part of town. Halfway there, she began to talk to someone on the phone with a voice that balanced between anger and fear. She named a man named Derek and said, "If he finds me, he will do something." Her breathing sped. She asked me to take an alley route, and I refused politely, citing safety. That refusal turned the conversation into an argument with stakes that felt like a taut wire in the air. At the next intersection, 2 men stepped out of the shadows and started to walk quickly toward the car. The middle of the ride became a slow-motion sequence. I remembered Sam from the garage saying once, "Light and witnesses can save you." I pulled into a plaza before the men reached the car and locked the doors. One of the men pounded on the glass and shouted, "She has my phone!" Maya screamed and tried to push at the window. The men were shouting names I did not recognize. Dispatch told me to call 911 and to not open the doors. The police operator walked me through exact words to say and to avoid sudden movements because that could start a panic. I kept my voice low and steady in the car while Maya hit a string of short, frantic sentences into the app message box, which the company uses to flag safety concerns. The men left after a minute when they were noticed by people on the sidewalk, and Maya sobbed until the police arrived. That ride read like a study in how public visibility and procedural steps can act as a shield. Between those 5 rides, I had to file incident reports, meet with dispatch, and later speak to investigators. The process of drafting an incident report within the ride-sharing app is precise. Drivers must log the trip ID, the timestamps, passenger names if available, and a narrative. The company then assigns a safety team that reviews GPS tracks, trip timelines, and any uploaded media. Law enforcement often requests data, and the company cooperates through a formal request process that includes preservation holds on account data. Those steps matter because they create an auditable chain of events that can be used to corroborate witness statements and for evidence should charges be filed. I had to provide my phone logs and a written statement. Officers explained to me how they would extract the GPS data and cross-reference it with CCTV images from nearby businesses in the time span I reported. The technical explanation surprised me with its detail, but comforted me with its thoroughness. The investigation phase was messy in an ordinary bureaucratic way. Captain Ramirez of the local precinct arranged interviews with several passengers and convened a review that included a campus safety officer and a representative from the ride-sharing company. The rumor mill among other drivers started to spin. Talk of a man named Derek, of masks, of guns, of photographs. I sat for several hours in an interview room and narrated the rides again and again. The detective asked precise questions that reduced memory to coordinates and times. What time did you pull into the gas station? How long between the red light and the bridge? Did you ever see the gun leave the car?
Each question created a new dimension of accuracy. The team cataloged the statements of passengers like Lydia, Marcus, Olivia, Tom, and Maya. They also pulled the app logs and matched them to the city CCTV. A public affairs officer cautioned us all about conjecture. "We work from facts," she said. Outside, the press asked for statements, and the news cycles began to ask why a driver would pick up certain passengers at night. The line between curiosity and invasion blurred. The ride-sharing company temporarily suspended one account, pending review, and issued a statement about driver and passenger safety. In the days that followed, there were forums where drivers compared notes, and a manager named Carla organized a meeting at the garage to brief us on new safety protocols. The community response was a combination of concern, criticism, and policy suggestions. The longer arc of consequence stretched beyond immediate investigation. After the incidents, the company updated parts of its safety flow, making the emergency button more prominent and approving a feature that allowed drivers to send automated alerts to local dispatchers. The city hosted a panel with representatives from ride-sharing companies, police, and driver associations to discuss safer pickup points and better lighting in vulnerable areas. In my meetings, I recommended increased training for conflict de-escalation and for the company to coordinate more directly with local safety officers like Sam. There were also legal ramifications. Some of the passengers pursued restraining orders, and in one case, the police made an arrest based in part on the GPS trail and an uploaded image of a discarded mask. The suspect was charged and later released on bail, but the criminal complaint referenced my statements and the app logs as part of the evidence. The procedural language in the report was clinical, but the human effects were not. Families called and texted to ask if we were all right. Marcus messaged me weeks later to say he had gone into therapy. Tom sent an email thanking me for stopping the car at the bridge. Those small acknowledgments became part of the outcome in ways that mattered more than headlines. There were moments of tension that I still replay in slow motion when I feel the car's steering wheel under my hands. One of those moments was the gas station where Alex left his gun on the seat. I can close my eyes and see the fluorescent light, hear the cooling of the engine, smell the metallic tang that clung to the upholstery. For a full paragraph, I remember how time stretched and how a single decision to stop at that pump may have prevented injury. The choice to stay calm and to engage in conversation was both a gamble and a necessary human response. Another stretched moment was the concert backseat performance where the mask and the duffel bag could have meant escalation at any time. The pause before Olivia stood up and asked to leave felt like the point where social courage interrupted a possible spiral. The third slow-motion moment was at the plaza when the men approached Maya and the pounding on the glass reverberated through the car. The instructions from the dispatcher to call 911 and to avoid sudden moves created a choreography of survival that I followed word by word. In each of these slows, there were internal calculations, memories of training and of my sister, and a decision to choose a path that prioritized visibility and witnesses over confrontation. After the official proceedings slowed and reports were filed, the travel continued, but not without a change in me and in the ways we moved through the city. The company instituted a small fund for emergency training that Carla organized, and Sam, the garage security officer, started to bring coffee to late-shift drivers and to report suspicious behavior proactively. Community conversations emerged in local online groups about safe pickup spots and about how drivers and passengers can help each other. I learned to ask for visible identification when picking up from large events, to stop in spaces with cameras, and to be precise in logging odd behaviors. The practical changes felt like new muscles being built. 1 month later, I was still checking the rearview mirror for signs I had not noticed before. The police had completed their initial interviews and had closed the file on one incident with a referral to a mental health crisis team for a passenger who showed signs of severe distress. I felt an underlying exhaustion that I did not fully understand at first. My nights were still mostly routine, but I now kept a small flashlight in the door pocket, and I made a practice of noting the nearest open place whenever I picked up in a dim area. Passengers I had driven began to text more often to say they were okay. There was a public meeting at the garage where Carla handed out printed sheets about emergency features in the app, and we practiced scenarios. The community had shifted toward a pragmatic solidarity. I remember standing outside the garage afterwards, the cold air on my face, and thinking that the city felt slightly more watchful but also more raw. The notebook under the seat had grown thicker with entries and fragments of dialogue. That accumulation of words became a kind of record that helped me tell the story clearly when asked. 3 months later, a minor court hearing had taken place related to one of the incidents, and the charges were still unresolved. The ride-sharing company had issued a blog post about safety initiatives, and the local paper ran a piece that quoted me about the importance of lighted pickup points. I had to give another statement to a detective who wanted clarification on timeline details. The interviews were tiring but precise, and they made me acutely aware of the role of documentation. Outside, other drivers had started to change their routes at night, and city planners had begun to consider improved lighting at several pickup zones near entertainment districts. I found myself refusing fares that required long entry into poorly lit alleys and suggesting alternative, public spots, even if it meant a slightly longer walk for a passenger. Some passengers pushed back. Others thanked me with the relief that only real gratitude offers. I had also begun talking to a counselor again because the memory of hands and masks and pounding on glass had left me with a tightness in the chest that would not fully relax on its own. 6 months on the legal outcomes were mixed. One individual had been arrested and then released on bail pending trial. Another case was closed with a referral to social services after a judge determined that the person in question needed treatment more than punishment. The company had retooled certain elements of its safety design based on our feedback, adding an improved safety messaging flow and a function to alert multiple drivers nearby in case of an ongoing threat. There was also a small but meaningful policy change in our local drivers group, where we agreed to meet once a month and share strategies for safer pickups. Personally, I had regained a measure of peace, but not complacency. I had been altered by the knowledge that a night ride could become a fraught space in seconds. I no longer left my notebook under the seat. I kept the flashlight and a new habit of asking for a well-lit meeting point. And when I close my eyes now, I still see the pale strip of light in the rearview mirror, the image that keeps returning to me like a film loop. That light is my final memory of those nights, a small, bright corridor that became both a literal and metaphorical lifeline. If you travel at night, or if you drive others for a living, consider 3 practical steps I learned the hard way. First, choose pickup and drop-off locations that are public and well lit. Second, use the app features to share trip details with a trusted friend, and do not be afraid to cancel a trip if the environment feels unsafe. Third, document unusual behavior with timestamps and brief notes. The chain of information you create can be crucial in an investigation. I tell this not to create fear, but to offer tools that helped me feel safer. I do not tell these stories to sensationalize or to claim moral superiority. I tell them because reality sometimes refuses the neat shape we prefer. I returned home after those months with a new caution and with compassion for people who act out of fear and pain. I thought I would exchange the car for a more conventional job, but instead continued driving, now with more awareness of what a night can contain. My final image is simple and persistent. When I park the car and step out, I look at the rearview mirror one last time, and the pale strip of light on the glass, the glow of the dashboard, and the faint outline of a passenger seat remind me that the most ordinary journeys can hide urgent stories. If this account resonated with you and you want to hear more first-hand ride stories and practical safety steps, consider subscribing to this channel. Share this with someone who travels late and leave a comment with one short sentence about what you would do in a tense moment. Your voice could help someone else decide their next move.